I have to start, unfortunately, with a kind of peculiar remark. I'll be speaking from a kind of schizophrenic position, and for two reasons. One, Croatia does not belong to the Western Balkans at all, anymore, for the last full 10 months. And the title of the session is Towards Stability in the Western Balkans. However, what is much more important, I do not believe that stability is what's needed in the Western Balkans. And that's the crucial issue. As to the first part, Croatia is now for 10 months proudly outside of the Balkans. And everything, literally everything in Croatia is worse than it was last year. With one exception, I can phone from Vienna to Zagreb much cheaper than a year ago, but I do not believe that the European Union was founded to make my communication easier and cheaper. It is, of course, a coincidence. This is not something that has to be understood as the responsibility of the European Union. But it's the consequence of the fact that Croatia entered the European Union too late. In the worst part of the European crisis and Croatian crisis. And, of course, everyone in Croatia opposing to what was expected believed now we are inside, we can do whatever we like. For instance, we can start again harassing Serbs because we are not going to be monitored anymore. We are now one of these nations where, of course, harassing minorities is not something unprecedented. The way to cultivate Balkan nations to enter the European Union is to tell them you cannot harass Serbs or Croats or Bosniaks, because after entering the European Union, you can only harass Roma, Gypsy population. That's the cultivated European way of behavior. And some of our guys have already learned this. There are these guys in the Balkans are ready to learn quite quickly, especially so-called loopholes and everything else that might be used. But back to real problems. The idea was stability after the war in the region. There were things that has happened to relations between Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Montenegro after the war was the fact that Croatia has entered the European Union. Now the borders are much worse, much more firm, much more harder to cross. In the other parts of Europe, European Union meant less borders. In this part of Europe, European Union meant more borders. And borders that are every day more complicated to get by. And therefore, this post-war stability was not given. But the real question is, what was meant with this funny word, stability? Maybe in terms used by our chairperson, in terms of macroeconomics, and stability could go with growth, something can be done. But in political terms, it's something else. We have had in Europe decades of good old Cold War stability. Everything was in order. It was everything clear, everyone knew where his or her place was. Then the fall of the wall came. And the whole interpretation of the post-Cold War situation came ideologically from the side of the street, from the sunny side of the street, on which the wall didn't fall. The other side of the street, the side where in the rubbles of the wall, people were fighting to survive, and many didn't mention this, didn't have success in this, was almost forgotten. And the facts are, more than 300,000 persons were killed after the fall of the war. More than 700,000 people were wounded or invalids in the wars. Almost 14 million people were displaced, and 35 million persons have lost their jobs. Now there are two schools of thinking. One would say, this is the consequence of the fall of the wall. The other would say, no, this is the consequence of the situation that was kept under pressure, under political pressure, during the Cold War, and which exploded when the wall has fallen. In both cases, normality was not such a good thing. Normality meant Brezhnev. Normality meant Tito. Or normality meant Milosevic or Kuchma, who is now somehow forgotten, or Putin. Victims and families of the victims are reservoir of the votes for Putin and guys like him. This nostalgia for Soviet Union is not just nostalgia for good old imperial days. It's nostalgia for a situation in which the price of a ticket for the Moscow subway was between 1919 and 1989 always the same, 1 kopieka. And this is the fact of life. The fact that people after the beginning of 50s were by far not so often killed in Moscow as they are killed today. There were some 30 years of relative stability. In my home country of Croatia, for 40 years, between 1950 and 1990, no one was killed for political reasons. There were killings outside of Croatia done by the Yugoslav secret services. And that was the longest period of time in the history of the whole region. And suddenly, we have liberalization, we have fulfillment of all our dreams, and now it means war. It resembles to an old fairy tale, which is a good place and time to be once again mentioned here. Old fisherman catches a goldfish, and then the fish says, you have 3 wishes, and says, okay, but the fish, which is methodologically correct, tells him, you have to be careful what you wish. He says, I know what I wish. I want to be a young prince. I want to have handsome princess as my wife, and I have to live in a nice castle. Okay? Now he wakes up in a huge bed, and the young princess comes to him and says, Franz Ferdinand, hurry, we have to go to Sarajevo. The problem is, wishes and dreams are never precise. And you could have heard thousands of times after 1990, we have fulfilled all our wishes or even our dreams. And that's always a reason to be somehow afraid, because it might be horrible. Normality, therefore, is something what we do not need. We need change. Normality and change cannot come together as well or as bad as equality and freedom. Only very bad politicians in pre-election speeches would somehow declare that they can fulfill more equality and more freedom. And those politicians now reside mostly in the post-communist countries. The others have somehow learned the lesson. You can't do this. We need change, we need development, we need new concepts, we need something that would put stability in question. When we accept stability, then you have, come back to my country, this lazy belief in Croatia, that the very fact of coming into European Union means tomorrow it's going to be better. Meaning a bit more money, a bit more freedom, a bit more of this and a bit less of what we don't want to see. And this does not happen. Because stability is something you have to produce. Stability needs political pressure. Stability is, so to say, natural habitat for those who are privileged. For unprivileged, stability is danger. And our colleague Shevtsova has said 2 hours ago, there is no stability with Putin in Russia. The problem is, there is no stability without Putin in Russia. You just try to imagine what would happen after Putin. Or what would happen after the reign of communists in China. I'm not advocating good old days. I'm not advocating Cold War. I just want all of us to be aware of the price that has to be paid, including human lives. And somehow, cynically, almost no one is ready to take this price into account. Almost when they say, okay, it was better we have free elections every 4 years, we can elect new idiots instead of all idiots, and that's a very important improvement of our political and social life. We don't have to watch always the same idiots, with the exception of Montenegro, of course, in the public. But hundreds of thousands of persons killed, lives destroyed, people lost their social stability and environment is a very high price. And this is why I'm going to end with a very simple question. Should we really, since I'm in Vienna, I have to quote Freud, act as those physicians Freud criticized by saying they sometimes tend to cure their own illnesses in their patients. And that's never the solution. Thank you very much.